One of Iran's top nuclear scientists, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, has been assassinated after gunmen opened fire on his car. Tehran points the finger of blame at Israel, saying it's trying to provoke a war. One of Iran's top nuclear scientists has been assassinated. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh died of his wounds after gunmen fired on his car. Israel and Western intelligence agencies accuse him of being one of the founders of the country's covert nuclear weapons program. Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif was quick to point the finger at Israel. He tweeted, "Terrorists murdered an eminent Iranian scientist today. This cowardice, with serious indications of Israel, shows desperate warmongering of perpetrators." Dr. Trita Parsi is an Iran expert with the non-partisan think tank, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He told me who he believes is behind the assassination.
Well, I think, obviously there's no clear evidence at this point, but Israel is the most likely culprit here because the combination of political intent and capacity to do this really reduces the list to only two countries, the United States and Israel. And Bibi Netanyahu has a clear interest in this. If the Iranians respond, he may get the war that he's been trying to start for more than a decade. If they don't, still, it will really damage the prospects for renewed diplomacy under Biden. But it's also unlikely, however, I think it's important to point out that if Israel is behind it, that it would do so without some form of at least a tacit green light from the Trump administration.
OK, so why would Israel be targeting him in particular if that is indeed the case?
Well, remember in 2018 when the Israelis had done a raid in Iran and confiscated a large number of documents related to the Iranian nuclear program, Netanyahu specifically mentioned Fakhrizadeh and said, remember his name. He is a key person in the Iranian nuclear program. He has been a target in the past, no successful attempt at his life, of course, until today. And he has been extremely heavily guarded, which also means that this is quite an embarrassment for the Iranian government, that deep inside of Iranian territory, some country, most likely Israel, could conduct such an assassination.
We should say that so far there has been no comment from either Israel or from the US Defense Department, the Pentagon. This is according to the news agencies. What do you think the next step would be in the development of events following this?
Well, I think the ball is in Iran's court, of course, but to a certain extent also in the court of Europe and the Biden team. If the Europeans condemn this, if the Biden team condemn this, then there is somewhat of a likelihood that the Iranians will show restraint. In fact, a very senior former U.S. official who is associated with the Biden team, Brennan, just tweeted about an hour ago the importance of the Iranians showing restraint. But he also went further and he called this a criminal act. He suggested that it would be a state-sponsored act, which is quite critical because, again, the list of countries that could have done this that are states is really very, very small, only the United States and Israel. So that seems to be an indirect way for him to call out Israel.
And then in terms of the context, the wider context of this, just earlier this month, concerns were raised about the amount of enriched uranium that Iran has built up. How significant do you think the targeting of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh is in that context?
In that context, I think it is particularly important because at the end of the day, even the past assassinations, which Israel did conduct, it did not have an effect on the trajectory of the Iranian nuclear program. It certainly had an impact on the program, but it was not a decisive impact. And in fact, when the Obama administration condemned these acts, they did so precisely because they knew that ultimately the target was not the nuclear program, because these assassinations will not have that type of an impact. The target back then, and likely today as well, was actually renewed diplomacy between the United States and Iran.